Good morning.
Good morning, Lord.
We're starting off this morning in Daniel chapter 3, and I was thinking of this passage because I think of the way that today we are pressured in so many ways to follow certain things that culture follows, to believe certain things that culture believes, to act the way culture acts, and to maybe even be tempted to hide our faith because culture can be so anti-God sometimes. The temptation can be there, and the pressure can be there for people to jump in with the crowd. Nobody wants to feel like they're not fitting in a lot of the time. And here we see some people who really were in a powerful way put in a place to stand their ground for God. And I want this to be an encouragement to us as we experience these temptations to falter in standing our ground for God. Daniel chapter 3, I want to begin in verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and width 6 cubits, and he set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Now, we all know what happened with Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon and all that because we had Carol's message this morning that talked about that. There were twice that the Israelites were conquered. They were conquered once by the Assyrians in 722 BC, and again here by the Babylonians in 586 BC. The siege went on for some years, but it was completed in 586, and the Israelites were taken from their land and spread out, and here they are among the people of Nebuchadnezzar, and we see him react differently. I don't want to say this. We see him in different situations. Actually, he's reacting the same way, and in which he's involved in some kind of conflict that God has to intervene in, and he opens his eyes to the truth of who God is, but yet he keeps messing up and keeps falling away from him and keeps focusing on these ungodly practices of worshiping things other than God. We see in the previous chapter where Daniel came and had to help interpret a dream for him, and he saw the power of God and proclaimed the power of God. And here we see it again in this passage we're about to go through. We know of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and we see him back at it again after he sees the power of God and declares the power of God. We see it a few chapters later in chapter 7 where he's back at Daniel and throwing him in the lion's den. But here we are, and he set up this image of gold. Its height was 60 cubits, and its width was 6 cubits. Now, if you remember a while back, we talked about these obelisks, like the one in Egypt, and the one in Paris, and the one in New York, and the one in DC, and the one at the Vatican. And tracing back to their original roots, they go even further back than Egypt to the time of Babylon, and even before Nebuchadnezzar here. And it's described by its measurements. Its height is 10 times the width of its base. So King Nebuchadnezzar, I'm going to summarize some of this because it's a long chapter, but basically he gathered everybody up. He gathered up all the leaders, it says the satraps, the administrators, governors, counselors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, all these people. He gathers them up and he brings them to this assembly. He brings them to this dedication for this image made of gold, and he has this herald who makes this announcement and cries out to everybody, all you people in your different peoples, nations, and languages, whenever you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, the psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, you should fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up, and whoever doesn't will be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. He's set up this image, this golden image of worship that they're supposed to bow down before every time it's like musical chairs. Every time the music stops, you got to sit down. But every time the music kicks on here, everybody's supposed to stop what they're doing and go bow down and worship this thing. And he's putting them in a position where they have to decide, are they going to hold firm to their faith? Those who have faith in the one true God, are they going to hold firm to their faith, or are they going to give in to the pressure, facing the threat of death, to worship what is ungodly, to accept and follow what is ungodly? Look at verse 7. So at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, and in symphony with all kinds of music, all the people and nations and languages, they fell down and worshipped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now, I don't know if you remember his dream very well, but in this dream, well, let's turn back to chapter 2 for a moment. He had this dream, and he had all these wise men who were supposedly able to interpret things like this for him and give him the wisdom that he needed. And he called them to him and he said, hey, I need you guys to interpret this dream for me, but to make sure you're authentic, first I want you to tell me what my dream was. And think about how maybe wise that was on his part for something like this, because if he'd have just said, hey, I had this dream, what does it mean? They could have made up anything. But he said, so I know that you're not trying to fool me. I want you to tell me what my dream was. And I'm like, oh, nobody can do that. We can't do that. And he was going to have all of the wise men basically of the time put to death. And when he sent his guard, his military leader basically out to make these things happen, Daniel saw what was happening, and he prayed to God for him to give him wisdom on this and to give him the dream and to give him the interpretation of it. And if we go to 2:31, we see where Daniel came to him. And he said, he brought this to the king. The king didn't tell him. He said, you, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image, this great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze. And it goes on to describe the different aspects of this being in this dream. And when he goes to interpret it, look at what he says. Go down to verse 37. He explains to Nebuchadnezzar, you, O king, are a king of kings. Now, we know Jesus is the King of Kings. That's not what Daniel's saying here. It can kind of sound like he's saying something ungodly here. But really, he is this powerful world leader who has conquered several other nations. So these other nations still, they have their own leadership among them to a degree, but he is over them. So he is a leader over other leaders. He's over this hierarchy of people. But he says, you, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, and the birds of heaven, he has given them into your hand. And he has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. Now, we don't know exactly how much time passed between chapter 2 and chapter 3. From the time Daniel gave him this interpretation to the time when we see him setting up this image here. But it seems that this might have gone to his head a little bit. You had this dream of this powerful thing, this powerful being, and it's got this golden head, and that's you. You're the one that's the top dog. You're the one in authority. He explains that those other parts were other nations that would conquer him eventually. But for now, he's this golden head. He's this powerful, all-powerful guy. And so what does he do? He makes a golden image. Maybe it's his own representation of what he saw himself as this golden head. And he wants to be worshipped. And he wants this image to be worshipped. And it says all the peoples, nations, and languages. And these were different nations that were captured by Babylon. So, how can we relate to that? We're not living in a nation that's conquered by some other nation, and we're just under an umbrella of power like they are. But we can relate to their story because we're living it. It might not be in the direct same way, but man, aren't God's people today forced to live in a very ungodly culture, in a very ungodly society? Doesn't it almost feel like you're away from home sometimes because we're citizens of this earth, but we're also citizens in heaven once we're Christians. And it just sometimes I think, man, this place is a mess, and I'm just sick of being here. And we're surrounded by ungodly culture. We're constantly facing pressures to believe what they believe, to do what they're doing, to behave like they're behaving, to accept all forms of ungodliness, or else whatever that might be, or else you're going to be treated differently, or else you're going to be mocked, or else you're going to be ridiculed, pressured. And that's happening in a lot of ways. People's beliefs and their behavior and their actions are under threat of being forced into adapting and changing to meet cultural desires, and in greater ways than we see here. Right now, many times recently in China, there have been people that have been locked out of their own bank accounts. They've been frozen out of being able to use them because maybe they said something online that went against what the government said, or maybe they are people who have protested certain things. They're trying to stand up for their beliefs, and they're being stepped on and pressured. And look at how this happens in different ways throughout the world. People are being pressured to accept things they don't want to accept, to not stand up for things that they want to stand up for. In the United Kingdom recently, there were some children that were attacked. They were stabbed by some illegal migrants that were there, and the police let them go. They didn't press any charge. They didn't do anything to them, and people protested. And there ended up being some clashes, but the people who protested were arrested for basically like hate crimes for saying anything. Anyone who complained about it on social media, they're being arrested right now for the things that they're saying. And there are a lot of places throughout the world where people are being pressured into controlling their behavior. Maybe they can't force you to think something, but they can keep you from being able to say it with the right pressures sometimes. And we have to be really careful because we don't fully see that here, but we're seeing bits and pieces of it here. We're seeing a lot of censorship here. We're seeing a lot of things here that have already been implemented in other countries, almost like it's testing for that. And we have to be really careful because even though it's not fully something that is a threat to us right here and right now, you can see it building up if you're paying attention to other places in the world. I used to have this Jeep that I loved. It was probably still the favorite vehicle I've ever had. I love this thing, my little blue Jeep, and kept it in as best shape I could for a very long time. And one day I was going to work and I shut my door, and half the bottom of the door fell off, and it was a hole like this big around. Like, what in the world is this? And there wasn't a spot of rust on it that I could see that I never noticed, but there was this huge hole rusted out now, and I got to checking it out, and there was a ton of rust in there, but it just hadn't bubbled through the surface yet. I could see little bits where the paint was starting to ripple, but it was beneath the surface enough to where I didn't see it. And we have to be careful because a lot of threats out there are just kind of bubbling beneath the surface in ways that if we're not paying attention, they can sneak up on us. And man, that hole got bigger and bigger. I'd find chunks of steel in my driveway half the time from falling out of that stupid door, but I love that car still. But we're pressured like they were to say and to believe and to do and to accept what we wouldn't normally under godly circumstances or else. And these guys were about to experience that or else. And we see in this next section that the Chaldeans came forward and they'd accused them. And they said, they went and they buttered up the king, and they said, didn't you say every time the music plays that we've got to go bow down before this thing? And if that doesn't happen, those people are going to get thrown into this fiery furnace. Well, just so you know, there's these certain Jews over here that you've set over the affairs of the province of Babylon. As we see in the previous chapter, that after this dream interpretation, they were given a degree of power. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. and look at how the king responds. Verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar spoke, and saying to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Now if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning, fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" Look at how he responds. He responds in rage and fury. When you challenge someone wicked in power, it brings a fire into them. And look at the way this is worded, if we think about this. He says, if you do this, you hear that music and you worship, you're all good. But if not, you're going to be cast immediately into the midst of a burning, fiery furnace. And it almost reminds me of what God said to Cain when he knew he was about to kill Abel. He said, hey, don't, just to super paraphrase, don't overdo it here. If you do the right thing, then good. You're all fine. You're all set. You're all good. But if not, sin's waiting at the door. Destruction is waiting at the door. And they're under threat of this fiery furnace. But look at how inflated his own ego is. What's that last sentence? And who is the God who could deliver you from my hands? Wow, he really let that dream go to his head, thinking he's so big. What God out there could possibly challenge me? What God out there could possibly save you from me? I am so powerful. Let's go back to chapter 2 again for a second. He saw a display of God's power. Go down towards the bottom. He saw a display of God's power in this interpretation of this dream, and he reacted like you would hope he'd react, and he praised God. Look at verse 47. Chapter 2, verse 47. The king answered Daniel and said, truly, your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret. And then he promoted Daniel and the others. But here he goes. We don't know how much time has passed here. The next event after this that we know a timeline on is about 20 years after that dream. So this experience with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was anywhere from 0 to 20 years after that dream. So it could have been a little while after. It could have been the next week. Or it could have been 10, 15 years later. But he went from saying, wow, your God, he's the one. He is the God of gods. And now he's at a point in his arrogance where he says, yeah, what God can save you from me? And we have to be very careful not to let our pride inflate our ego to things like this. And when we face people like this, when we face situations like this, we need to stand firm in our faith. Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, I'm back in chapter 3. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the golden image which you have set up. They made it very clear. We don't even have to respond to you. Do what you're going to do and watch what our God does. He has every bit of power to save us from this. He has every bit of power to free us from this. But even if he doesn't, I'm not worshiping your gods. God may not save us from every situation in this life. Praise God when he does. He may not. But are we going to stand firm and not worship these false gods that are in the same sense that they weren't willing to worship these false gods? Think of the way that we might compromise in life in general. We might not have a golden image that we're expected to bow down before. But are we pressured into ungodliness? Are we pressured into holding our tongue? Are we pressured into celebrating things that we shouldn't be celebrating? You know, they said, we will not serve your gods, and that's a lot like the societal pressures that we're faced with every day. And we have to tell ourselves, no, I'm not going to serve your gods. I know this goes against what my God wants. I know this goes against what God is working in me. I'm not going to serve your gods. And they were blunt about it. Like Paul was in our lesson this morning, where he was very bold and blunt against that sorcerer, well, would-be sorcerer. He said, let it be known to you, king. Listen up, buddy. We want to make this very clear. And are we letting it be known where we stand? And I don't mean with a blunt, prideful, arrogant kind of in people's face way, but are we living a life that makes it very clear where we stand? Do the words I say make it very clear where I stand with God? Are we letting it be known just by being it? So then he's irate. He's just full of fury, and his expression changed. He commanded that the heat had to be turned up 7 times what it normally would be. I mean, this is already a fire that is made to kill people, or that is enough to kill people. That was his plan. He wasn't planning on tossing them in and they get a heat rash and some blisters. This was an execution already. And the way it was all he needed as punishment that he had threatened these people with. And now he's saying, we're going to heat it up 7 times more than that, because his rage within him has caused him to just lose all rationality and just react in a violent way. And it's blinding him with fury and rage. And he says, no, we're going to turn this up 7 times more than that. And it says he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind them and cast them into this fiery furnace. So he's taking these big soldiers, saying, tie these guys up, toss them in there, crank it up 7 times what it is. It says they were bound in their coats and their trousers and their turbans and other garments, and they were cast in the midst of the fiery furnace. But it was so hot that the guys who took them up to throw them in died at the entrance to this thing. This was so hot that the guys throwing in the tied up people died just by getting close. And we know how the story ends. Verse 24. Wait, I'm sorry. I think it's interesting to point out in there that they took them up. It says they took them up, and it says that they dropped them in. So this wasn't just like a door that they walked through. They dropped them in through this chute. And, as I think about this, they had so many opportunities to cave in. They had so many opportunities to compromise their faith. I mean, how many of us would have caved at some other point along the way? Like, cops show up and say, hey, the emperor, the leader, wants to talk to you. Say, oh, no, I'll behave. We might panic and cave at an earlier point. When you're being tied up and being ready to be thrown into a furnace. When you're faced with the threat of a furnace. When he says, I'm going to turn this up 7 times. And at any point would we say, okay, you know what, we'll fall in line, we'll behave. Maybe I can make this up to God later. And I think we'd like to think that we wouldn't panic and give in. I think we would like to think that we would stand firm in the faith, and that we would be tough enough that we wouldn't cave, that we wouldn't give in to the same kind of temptation. But how often do we cave and give into the temptation of our culture without a threat of death, without a threat of a fiery furnace? Sometimes just the threat that somebody might look at us funny, or that we might not be accepted with someone. Things with little to no real threat that we cave on, that couldn't even compare to a fiery furnace. And that really just kind of illustrates just how committed these guys were to the faith, that they were willing to go to that. They were willing to go to that death, but they knew that, if it was God's will, he could and would save them from this. Verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste, and he spoke, saying to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." "Look," he answered, "see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the form of the fourth is like the Son of God." It's something that we have to remember when we're walking through those fires, just like they were in that fire. We're not alone. Just like this passage from Isaiah, when we're called to righteousness, God will hold our hand and walk us through it. When we're going through these fiery trials in life, God is going to be right there with us, walking us through it as we go. And we see just how safe they were. Verse 26, "And Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke, saying, 'Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here.' And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire. And the satraps, administrators, governors, and the king's counselors, they gathered together, and they saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them." This man went from rage to astonishment because the amazing work that God did. And that is what happens every single time one of these powerful rulers would stand up against God and his people, and they would stand firm in their faith, and God would show up and put his full power on display. And they would be like, "Wow, look how amazing this God is. He's the true God. This is the God we need to follow." And think about just how unimpacted by this fire they were. I don't know if you spend much time around a campfire, but you can't walk within 10 feet of it without smelling like one for the next couple days. And that's okay. I like the smell of campfire. But I have been around even a small campfire and just waved my arm over it, and every hair on my arm will singe down if you get close enough to it. It says not a hair on their head was singed. Their clothes weren't affected. There wasn't any soot on them. They didn't burn the hem and melt the hem of their garments. They didn't smell like it. It had no impact on them whatsoever. It says, "On whose bodies the fire had no power, but those mighty men of valor just got close to the entrance and were vaporized by this thing." They didn't have a singed hair. They didn't have the smell of smoke. It's this fire that had no power over them was a real fire. And most of the fires in our lives that make us feel the most threatened have no real power at all. It might just be the threat of something or the worry of something, or maybe it's even the worst case scenario built up in our head, and those are the fires that we think we're about to experience. And we have to be very careful how we react in situations like that. They were faced with a very physical and real threat, but they didn't allow that to influence them. They didn't give up on their faith. They didn't allow it to cause them to react in an ungodly way. And how often do we worry about something and react in an ungodly way to something that doesn't even have as much power as that fire? Maybe somebody looked at you funny and you snap at them. Maybe it's let's go to the timeless classic of traffic and the people that cut you off and the people that won't let you in. How many worries of potential pitfalls in life do we panic and react badly because of? Maybe we're snapping because we're worried about finances when everything's going to be fine. We just don't know it yet. There are a million ways that we got to be careful just don't react to a perceived threat that doesn't have any more power in our lives than that very real fire had in their lives. If they can trust God in the face of a real fire, why can't I trust him in the face of a fire I've cooked up in my head, or a fire that somebody else is just threatening me with? A fire that's not a fire at all, when it might not even come. Verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies, that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own." He said, "Who's the God who can save you from me?" And God showed up. In true form, he said, I am. He showed them, I am. I'm that God who can save them from you. And we don't always see God act in gigantic, miraculous ways, sending fire from heaven or saving people from a fiery furnace in our everyday lives. But he acts in these huge situations that can have a massive impact. So many times we see it throughout Scripture where entire nations were converted because God reached the leader through an act of power like this. But sometimes it's even just the little ways that he acts in our own life that he shows himself to us. It might mean nothing to somebody else, and it might even be little to you, but it's undeniable that he's the one acting and he's the one moving in your life. And it just influences us to remember that he is the one true God, that he is all powerful, that he is the one that we should serve and worship and none other. So how does it react? Verse 29, therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. And then he promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. He goes from threatening death to anyone who doesn't worship his false image, to threatening for anyone who stands against the one true God. And the people that he wanted to cut down, the people that he wanted to burn, ended up being lifted up higher. They were put in a better position. And, it might seem like if I'm going to stand my ground for my faith, the situation's going to get scary. Maybe best case scenario, I get through it. But if we're standing firm in the faith, God's going to do greater things. He's going to lift us up greater than we would have been. He's going to make us stronger within. Like part of our study passages earlier, those trials, those fires like these, they build perseverance in us. They build strength in us. He said there is no other God who can deliver like this. What do you need delivered from? I think we all probably need delivered for something, or hope to be delivered from something. What's your fiery furnace? What seems impossible in your life? Whether it's something that needs taken out of your life, or whether it's a fear or a perceived threat in your life that you're just worried about and can't overcome that worry. What seems impossible in your life? And think about the king's words here when he says, there is no other God who can deliver like this, who can free you the way this God can free you, who can save you the way he saves you. The same Son of God who delivered them in the fire, that was Jesus in there with them. The same Son of God who delivered them in the fire is the same one who went through the fire for us on that cross. And he's the same one who did that to bring us deliverance from our sin, to bring us deliverance from the pitfalls in our own lives, deliverance to an eternity with him rather than an eternity in destruction, so that we ourselves never have to face a fiery furnace. It's way hotter than 7 times his fire was. He said, there is no other God who can deliver like this. We need to think about how we need to turn to God for maybe something that we need delivered from. Have we been delivered from him initially? Do we have salvation? We need to evaluate ourselves. Have I turned in faith and repentance to Jesus for salvation? And once I have I turned to him to deliver me from all the little fires in my life, or even the big fires that I'm facing? We face a lot of opposition. We face a lot of fears, and we face a lot of things that seem to threaten us. But if we hold fast in our hope in God and the deliverance that he promises to bring us, he's going to get us through the fire. We're going to come out stronger, and we're going to be more powerful in him than we've ever been.